Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Cerdic, the founder and first king of Wessex. This enigmatic warrior king established one of the most influential kingdoms in Anglo-Saxon England, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the unified nation we know today. We'll softly explore his mysterious origins, his daring campaigns across southern Britain, and his lasting legacy that shaped English history for centuries to come, all while the gentle whispers of 6th century England lull you into restful sleep. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying these soothing historical tales. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps you have a favourite Anglo-Saxon king or queen you'd like me to cover next. Your suggestions always inspire our next peaceful journeys through history. And don't forget to subscribe to keep these calming chronicles coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the early medieval period carry you toward restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Cerdic, later known as the founder and first king of Wessex, emerged from the shadows of post-Roman Britain like a figure from legend itself. The year was 495 CE, and the island of Britain had been without Roman protection for nearly a century. The once mighty province of Britannia had fractured into a patchwork of competing kingdoms, tribal territories, and unstable alliances. It was into this world of uncertainty and opportunity that our Saxon warrior would step, forever changing the course of English history. The Britain that Cerdic encountered was vastly different from the ordered Roman province his predecessors might have known. Great stone roads still cut across the countryside, but they were increasingly dangerous to travel. Roman villas stood abandoned or had been converted into fortified strongholds by local chieftains. The sophisticated urban centres of Roman Britain, Londinium, Camulodunum, Verulamium, had either shrunk dramatically or been abandoned entirely. Native Celtic culture, suppressed but never destroyed during 4 centuries of Roman rule, began to reassert itself across much of the island. Yet this apparent chaos also presented unprecedented opportunities for ambitious leaders willing to seize them. The absence of centralized Roman authority meant that any warrior bold enough and skilled enough could potentially carve out his own domain. The native Britons, despite their cultural resurgence, were politically fragmented and often fought among themselves as much as against external threats. Into this volatile landscape came waves of Germanic settlers and warriors, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, seeking new homes, new opportunities, and new conquests. The story of these Germanic migrations to Britain is complex and often contradictory. Some came as invited mercenaries, hired by British kings to help defend against Pictish and Scottish raiders from the north. Others arrived as traders who gradually established permanent settlements. Still others came as outright invaders, taking advantage of British weakness to seize territory by force. Many probably fell into multiple categories at different times, shifting from mercenary to settler to conqueror as circumstances demanded. Archaeological evidence suggests that Germanic settlement began much earlier than the traditional date of 449 CE, often cited in medieval sources. Artifacts characteristic of Saxon, Angle, and Jutish material culture have been found in British contexts dating to the late 4th and early 5th centuries. These early settlers seem to have integrated relatively peacefully into Romano-British society, at least initially. They may have served in the Roman military, worked as craftsmen or farmers, or engaged in trade along the North Sea routes that connected Britain to the continental homelands. But by the mid-5th century, the nature of Germanic presence in Britain had clearly changed. Instead of small groups of settlers integrating into existing communities, we begin to see evidence of large-scale population movements, territorial conquest, and the establishment of distinctly Germanic political entities. This shift coincides with increasing pressure on Germanic peoples in their continental homelands, as Hunnic migrations displaced various tribes and disrupted traditional territorial arrangements. The traditional account of this period, preserved in sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Bede's ecclesiastical history, tells of specific leaders and dramatic events. According to these sources, the Saxon chieftains Hengist and Horsa were invited to Britain by a British king named Vortigern around 449 CE to help defend against northern raiders. Initially loyal to their British employers, these Saxon warriors eventually turned against their hosts beginning a century-long struggle for control of southern and eastern Britain. While modern historians question many details of this traditional narrative, it likely preserves authentic memories of the complex relationships between British rulers and Germanic mercenaries. The pattern of alliance followed by betrayal, cooperation followed by conquest, probably repeated itself many times across different regions and different decades as the old Roman order gradually gave way to new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It was against this backdrop of political transformation and cultural upheaval that Cerdic made his appearance in British history. Unlike the earlier Saxon leaders who had supposedly arrived as mercenaries or allies, Cerdic came as an independent war leader, with his own agenda of conquest and kingdom building. His story represents a crucial phase in the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain, when individual warriors could still reshape the political map through personal ambition and military skill. The sources that preserve Cerdic's story are problematic in many ways. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our primary source for his activities, was compiled several centuries after the events it describes. Its early entries often reflect later political propaganda rather than contemporary historical records. The Chronicle's portrayal of Saxon settlement as a series of coordinated invasions by heroic war leaders almost certainly oversimplifies a much more complex process of gradual infiltration, intermarriage, cultural assimilation, and occasional violent conquest. Yet despite these limitations, the Chronicle and other early sources preserve valuable information about the transformation of post-Roman Britain. They tell us about the geographical areas where different groups established themselves, the nature of their conflicts with British populations, and the eventual emergence of stable Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Most importantly for our purposes, they preserve the memory of Cerdic as a pivotal figure in this transformation, a leader whose personal ambitions helped create one of the most enduring and influential of the early English kingdoms. To understand Cerdic's significance, we must first understand the world into which he emerged. The collapse of Roman authority in Britain around 410 CE had created a power vacuum that various groups rushed to fill. In some regions, Romano-British elites maintained something resembling the Old Order, ruling from former Roman administrative centres and attempting to preserve classical culture and Christian religion. In other areas, native Celtic kingdoms reasserted traditional forms of political and social organisation that had survived beneath the surface of Roman rule. But increasingly, these British successors to Roman authority found themselves challenged by new players on the political stage. Germanic war bands, initially small and localised, began to establish permanent bases and attract additional followers from across the North Sea. What started as isolated settlements or mercenary companies gradually evolved into territorial kingdoms with their own political structures, military traditions, and cultural identities. The process was neither uniform nor inevitable. In some regions, Germanic settlers integrated peacefully with existing British populations, adopting local customs and even local languages. In others, conquest was violent and displacement nearly complete. Most areas probably experienced some combination of both patterns, with the balance depending on local circumstances, the personalities of individual leaders, and the broader political and military situation. Cerdic's career exemplifies this complex process of cultural and political transformation. His very name suggests the ambiguous nature of identity in post-Roman Britain. While most Saxon leaders bore recognisably Germanic names, Cerdic appears to derive from the Celtic name Caraticus, or Ceretic. This has led some historians to speculate that Cerdic may have been of mixed British and Saxon ancestry, or perhaps a British leader who adopted Saxon military customs and recruited Saxon warriors. Such cultural mixing was probably more common than our sources suggest. The political and military advantages of adopting successful innovations from neighbouring peoples would have been obvious to any ambitious leader. A British chieftain who could attract Saxon warriors to his banner, or a Saxon war leader who could win the loyalty of British subjects, would have significant advantages over rivals who remained culturally isolated. The landscape that Cerdic encountered in southern Britain bore the unmistakable marks of Roman occupation, even decades after the legion's departure. Great roads still crisscrossed the countryside, though they were increasingly dangerous and poorly maintained. Stone buildings, from humble farmhouses to elaborate villas, dotted the rural areas, though many showed signs of abandonment or conversion to new purposes. Fortified towns or burhs had begun to appear as local populations sought security in an uncertain world. But perhaps most importantly for an ambitious war leader like Cerdic, this landscape was also marked by political fragmentation and military opportunity. The absence of centralized authority meant that successful military campaigns could quickly translate into territorial gains. The presence of wealthy settlements, both British and Saxon, provided potential targets for raids or sources of tribute, and the complex web of alliances, rivalries and shifting loyalties among various British and Saxon leaders created numerous opportunities for a skilled politician and warrior to advance his interests. Into this world of opportunity and danger stepped Cerdic, destined to become one of the most significant figures in early English history. His story begins, according to traditional accounts, with a sea voyage that would change the fate of southern Britain forever. The figure of Cerdic emerges from the mists of early medieval history like a shadowy colossus, his true origins shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Unlike many of his contemporary Saxon leaders, whose genealogies were carefully preserved and elaborated by later chroniclers, Cerdic's background remains frustratingly obscure. This very obscurity, however, may be the key to understanding his unique position in the complex world of 6th century Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our primary source for Cerdic's career, provides what appears to be a straightforward genealogy, tracing his descent back through a series of Germanic ancestors to the god Woden himself. According to this account, Cerdic was the son of Elasa, who was the son of Esla, who was the son of Gewis, and so forth in an unbroken line reaching back to divine origins. This type of genealogy was standard for Anglo-Saxon royal houses, serving both to legitimize their rule and to connect them to the broader Germanic cultural tradition. Yet modern scholars have noted significant problems with this official genealogy. Detailed analysis suggests that many of these ancestral names were borrowed from other Anglo-Saxon royal houses, particularly that of Bernicia in northern England. The genealogy appears to have been constructed centuries after Cerdic's death to provide his descendants with appropriately prestigious ancestry. Before Cerdic himself, the West Saxon royal genealogy has little historical basis and should be viewed as political propaganda rather than historical fact. More intriguingly, several elements of Cerdic's story suggest connections to the Celtic British population, rather than purely Germanic origins. His name itself is the most obvious puzzle. While his supposed descendants all bore recognisably Saxon names like Cynric, Ceolin, and Ceolwulf, Cerdic appears to derive from the British name Ceretic or Caraticus. This was not a Germanic name that had been adopted into Saxon usage, but a distinctly Celtic name that would have been immediately recognisable to British audiences. The implications of this naming pattern are profound. One possibility is that Cerdic was indeed of British ancestry, perhaps a Romano-British leader who adopted Saxon military customs and recruited Germanic warriors to his cause. This would help explain his remarkable success in establishing authority over both Saxon settlers and British populations in southern England. A leader who could speak both languages, understand both cultures, and command loyalty from both ethnic groups would have had significant advantages in the complex political landscape of post-Roman Britain. Another possibility is that Cerdic was of mixed ancestry, perhaps the son of a Saxon father and British mother, or vice versa. Such unions were probably more common than our sources suggest, particularly among the aristocratic classes where political marriages could cement alliances between different ethnic communities. A leader of mixed heritage might have been uniquely positioned to bridge the cultural divide between conqueror and conquered, settler and native. Some historians have proposed even more radical interpretations of Cerdic's identity. They suggest that he may have been a British war leader who adopted a Saxon persona for political reasons, or conversely, a Saxon leader who adopted a British name to enhance his legitimacy among native populations. In the fluid world of early medieval Britain, where personal identity was often less fixed than modern assumptions might suggest, such transformations would not have been impossible. Archaeological evidence from the regions where Cerdic operated provides additional clues about his possible origins and the nature of his following. Excavations in Hampshire and the Upper Thames Valley have revealed a complex pattern of cultural interaction between British and Saxon populations. Rather than showing evidence of wholesale population replacement, these sites suggest gradual cultural change with significant continuity in many aspects of daily life. Pottery styles, for example, show a gradual transition from Romano-British forms to distinctly Anglo-Saxon types, but with many hybrid forms that combine elements from both traditions. Burial practices similarly show a mixing of British and Saxon customs, with some graves containing both British and Saxon artefacts. Settlement patterns suggest that many Romano-British sites continued to be occupied, though often with modifications to suit Saxon preferences. This archaeological picture is consistent with a model of Saxon settlement that involved significant cultural mixing rather than simple conquest and displacement. A leader like Cerdic, who could navigate both British and Saxon cultural expectations, would have been well suited to manage this complex process of integration and transformation. The early career of Cerdic, insofar as it can be reconstructed from fragmentary sources, also suggests connections to the broader world of late antique politics and warfare. Some scholars have proposed that he may have served as a Roman military officer or allied commander before striking out on his own as an independent ruler. This would help explain his apparent military expertise and his ability to organise effective campaigns against both British and Saxon opponents. The late Roman military system relied heavily on allied commanders and federate troops drawn from barbarian populations. These foederati, as they were known, were granted land and legal status within the empire in exchange for military service. As Roman authority weakened in Britain, such allied commanders may have gradually transformed themselves into independent rulers, using their military experience and existing networks of loyalty to establish new kingdoms. If Cerdic had indeed served in some official capacity under the late Roman administration in Britain, this would help explain several puzzling aspects of his career. His apparent familiarity with Roman military tactics and political organisation, his ability to attract followers from diverse ethnic backgrounds, and his success in establishing stable governmental institutions all suggest someone with experience in the sophisticated world of late Roman administration. The question of Cerdic's religious background is equally complex. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle presents him as a pagan, consistent with the traditional narrative of Germanic settlement. Yet some elements of his story suggest possible Christian connections. His apparent respect for existing British political and social structures, his willingness to work within established territorial boundaries, and his eventual establishment of what appears to have been a relatively tolerant multi-ethnic kingdom, all suggest someone familiar with Christian concepts of governance and law. It's worth noting that the divide between Christianity and paganism in 6th century Britain was not as sharp as later sources might suggest. Many British Christians had absorbed significant pagan elements into their religious practice, while Germanic paganism itself was undergoing rapid evolution in response to contact with Christian populations. A leader operating in this complex religious landscape would have needed to be diplomatically flexible and culturally sensitive to succeed. The geographical scope of Cerdic's activities also provides clues about his background and connections. Unlike some Saxon leaders who remained focused on relatively small territorial areas, Cerdic appears to have operated across a wide swathe of southern Britain. His campaigns took him from the Hampshire coast to the Upper Thames Valley, from Wiltshire downlands to the Dorset countryside. This geographical range suggests someone with extensive knowledge of British terrain, existing political networks, and probably established relationships with local populations. Such wide-ranging activities would have been difficult for an outsider arriving fresh from Germanic territories across the North Sea. They suggest instead someone who had already spent considerable time in Britain, who understood local conditions and opportunities, and who had built up networks of support and intelligence across multiple regions. Whether Cerdic acquired this knowledge through previous military service, trading activities, diplomatic missions, or simple residence in Britain, it clearly gave him significant advantages over competitors who lacked such local expertise. The timing of Cerdic's emergence as an independent leader is also significant. The traditional date of 495 CE places his arrival at a crucial moment in British history. The initial phase of Saxon settlement was largely complete, with established Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Kent, Sussex, and parts of eastern England. But the second phase of expansion, which would see Saxon control extended across most of lowland Britain, was just beginning. Cerdic appeared at precisely the right moment to take advantage of this expanding frontier of opportunity. This timing may not have been coincidental. The political and military situation in late 5th century Britain would have been closely monitored by ambitious leaders throughout the former Roman world. News of successful Saxon campaigns, British military weaknesses, and emerging territorial opportunities would have travelled through the complex networks of trade, diplomacy, and kinship that connected different regions. An experienced military leader like Cerdic would have been well positioned to assess these opportunities and time his own intervention for maximum advantage. The resources that Cerdic brought to his British campaigns also suggest careful preparation and extensive backing. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that he arrived with 5 ships, implying a substantial military force of several 100 warriors. Organising, equipping and transporting such a force would have required considerable wealth and organisational ability. It suggests that Cerdic was not a desperate refugee or opportunistic raider, but a well-funded military entrepreneur with specific strategic objectives. The source of this funding and support remains mysterious. If Cerdic was of British origin, he might have drawn on existing family wealth or political connections. If he was a Saxon leader, he might have received backing from established Anglo-Saxon kingdoms seeking to expand their influence. Alternatively, he might have been supported by continental Germanic rulers who saw opportunities for profit or political advantage in British ventures. Whatever his ultimate origins, Cerdic clearly possessed the combination of military skill, political acumen, cultural flexibility, and material resources necessary to succeed in the competitive world of early medieval Britain. His mysterious background may itself have been an asset, allowing him to reinvent himself as circumstances required and to appeal to diverse constituencies who might have been suspicious of leaders with more clearly defined ethnic or political identities. As we prepare to follow Cerdic's remarkable career from obscure origins to royal power, we must remember that his story reflects broader patterns of cultural transformation, political innovation, and social adaptation that characterized post-Roman Britain. He was both a product of his time and an agent of historical change, shaped by the opportunities and constraints of his era, while simultaneously reshaping the world around him through his actions and decisions. The mystery surrounding Cerdic's origins ultimately enhances rather than diminishes his historical significance. It reminds us that the neat categories and clear narratives beloved of later chroniclers often fail to capture the complex realities of lived experience in periods of rapid social and political change. Cerdic succeeded not despite his ambiguous background, but perhaps because of it, using the very uncertainty about his identity as a tool for building diverse coalitions and navigating treacherous political waters. In the year 495 CE, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, 5 ships appeared off the southern coast of Britain, their dragon-prowed vessels cutting through the grey waters of the English Channel like harbingers of change. Aboard these vessels was Cerdic, accompanied by his son Cynric, and a war band of seasoned warriors ready to carve out a new kingdom from the disputed territories of post-Roman Britain. Their landing point, known to later chroniclers as Cerdicesora, Cerdic's shore, would become the foundation point of one of the most enduring and influential kingdoms in English history. The choice of landing site was almost certainly deliberate and strategic. The Hampshire coast offered several advantages for an ambitious war leader planning a campaign of conquest. The natural harbours provided safe anchorage for ships and offered easy access to the interior via river valleys that penetrated deep into the countryside. The Solent, the strait separating the mainland from the Isle of Wight, created a natural defensive barrier while also providing opportunities for controlling maritime traffic along this crucial stretch of coastline. Perhaps most importantly, this region sat at the intersection of several different political and cultural zones. To the east lay the expanding Saxon kingdom of Sussex, established by Aelle and his sons earlier in the 5th century. To the north, the Upper Thames Valley was experiencing increasing Saxon settlement, though it remained largely under British control. To the west, the British kingdoms of Dumnonia and other Celtic territories maintained traditional forms of political organisation. A leader who could establish himself in this frontier zone would be well positioned to exploit opportunities in all directions. The archaeological record from this period reveals a landscape still bearing the clear marks of Roman occupation, but increasingly adapted to post-Roman realities. Roman roads continued to serve as major arteries for trade and military movement, though their maintenance had deteriorated significantly since the withdrawal of imperial administration. Fortified settlements, both Roman-era burhs and newly constructed defensive positions, dotted the countryside as local populations sought security in an uncertain world. The population that Cerdic encountered along the Hampshire coast was probably ethnically and culturally mixed. 4 centuries of Roman rule had created a Romanized British population with Latin as the language of administration and Christianity as the dominant religion, at least among the upper classes. But beneath this Roman veneer, older Celtic traditions and social structures had survived and were reasserting themselves as imperial authority weakened. Additionally, Germanic settlers had been present in this region for several generations before Cerdic's arrival. Archaeological evidence suggests that Saxon mercenaries and farmers had established small communities throughout the area during the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Some may have been invited by British authorities as military allies or agricultural colonists. Others probably arrived independently as traders or craftsmen. By 495 CE, these established Saxon populations would have formed an important constituency for any new Germanic leader seeking to establish authority in the region. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's account of Cerdic's landing emphasises immediate military action. The same day fought with the Welsh. This detail, whether historically accurate or not, reflects the hostile environment that any new arrival would have faced. The breakdown of Roman authority had not led to political vacuum, but rather to intensified competition among various British and Saxon leaders seeking to expand their territories and spheres of influence. The term Welsh used in this context is particularly interesting. In Anglo-Saxon usage, Whelers, or Welsh, simply meant foreigners, and was applied to all Celtic-speaking peoples, whether they lived in what we now call Wales or in other parts of Britain. The use of this term in connection with Cerdic's landing suggests that he faced opposition from organised British forces, not just scattered resistance from local populations. This opposition was probably led by regional British kings or war leaders who recognised the threat posed by a well-organised Saxon force establishing itself in their territory. The political landscape of late 5th century Britain included numerous such leaders, ruling territories that range from single settlements to extensive kingdoms encompassing multiple tribal areas. Many of these rulers were engaged in their own campaigns of expansion and consolidation, making the arrival of a new competitor a serious strategic concern. The military tactics that Cerdic employed during his initial campaigns can only be inferred from fragmentary evidence, but they probably reflected the sophisticated warfare of the late Roman period, rather than the crude raiding typical of earlier Germanic incursions. By the late 5th century, Saxon leaders had had several generations to observe and adapt Roman military practices. They understood the importance of fortified positions, supply lines, coordinated tactics, and political alliances in achieving lasting military success. Cerdic's force probably combined traditional Germanic warrior culture with these borrowed Roman innovations. His warriors would have fought primarily on foot, using the famous Saxon seax, long knife, along with spears, shields, and possibly some captured or manufactured Roman weapons. But unlike purely raiding forces, Cerdic's army was probably organised for sustained campaigning and territorial occupation rather than hit-and-run attacks. The 5 ships mentioned in the Chronicle would have carried between 200 and 400 warriors, depending on the size of the vessels and the amount of equipment they transported. This was a substantial force by the standards of early medieval warfare, large enough to defeat most local opposition, but small enough to move quickly and avoid being trapped by larger enemy coalitions. The size of the force also suggests careful planning and significant financial backing, as organising and equipping several hundred warriors for overseas campaigns would have required considerable resources. The warriors who followed Cerdic to Britain were probably drawn from diverse backgrounds and motivated by various factors. Some may have been landless younger sons of Saxon aristocratic families, seeking opportunities for advancement unavailable in their ancestral territories. Others might have been experienced mercenaries who had served various employers throughout the former Roman Empire. Still others could have been refugees from political or military disasters in their homelands, looking for new places to settle and rebuild their lives. What united these diverse followers was probably personal loyalty to Cerdic himself, reinforced by the promise of land, plunder, and social advancement through successful military service. The institution of the warrior band, or gesith, was central to Germanic society, and provided the organisational framework for most Saxon military and political activities. A successful war leader like Cerdic would have attracted followers through his demonstrated ability to provide for their material needs and social aspirations. The immediate aftermath of Cerdic's landing probably involved a series of small-scale engagements with local British forces as he sought to establish secure bases and eliminate immediate threats to his position. The Chronicle's mention of fighting the same day suggests that British opposition was both immediate and organised, indicating that local rulers were well informed about Saxon activities and prepared to respond quickly to new threats. These initial conflicts would have served multiple purposes beyond simple territorial conquest. They would have allowed Cerdic to assess the military capabilities and political organisation of his opponents, to identify potential allies and enemies among local populations, and to demonstrate his military prowess to both his own followers and potential recruits. Success in these early engagements would have been crucial for maintaining the morale and loyalty of his warband, while attracting additional supporters from among the existing Saxon population. The establishment of Cerdicesora as a name location suggests that Cerdic quickly moved beyond mere raiding, to begin the process of territorial control and political organisation. Unlike temporary raiding bases, permanent settlements required ongoing relationships with local populations, secure supply lines, and defensive preparations against counterattacks. The naming of the landing site after Cerdic himself indicates that his followers saw this as the beginning of a lasting political enterprise rather than a temporary military adventure. The strategic position of Cerdicesora would have provided several advantages for Cerdic's longer-term objectives. Control of this coastal area would have allowed him to maintain communications with potential allies or sources of supply across the English Channel. It would have given him influence over maritime trade routes that connected Britain to continental markets, and it would have provided a secure base from which to launch campaigns deeper into British territory. The relationship between Cerdic and existing Saxon populations in the region is particularly important for understanding his subsequent success. Rather than seeing established Saxon communities as competitors, Cerdic appears to have worked to incorporate them into his expanding political coalition. This required diplomatic skills as well as military prowess, as existing Saxon leaders would have had their own territorial claims and political ambitions. The process of building these coalitions probably involved a combination of marriage alliances, shared military ventures, distribution of captured wealth, and negotiated agreements about territorial boundaries and spheres of influence. Successful Germanic leaders of this period were as much politicians and diplomats as they were warriors, needing to maintain complex networks of personal relationships that could provide military support, economic resources, and political legitimacy. The British response to Cerdic's establishment along the Hampshire coast was probably complicated by their own internal divisions and competing priorities. British kingdoms were engaged in their own struggles for territorial control and political supremacy, making coordinated resistance to Saxon expansion difficult to organise and maintain. Some British leaders may have seen opportunities to use Saxon military power for their own purposes, while others recognised the long-term threat posed by Germanic territorial expansion. This fragmented British response created opportunities for ambitious Saxon leaders like Cerdic to exploit divisions among their opponents through selective alliances, targeted military pressure, and diplomatic manipulation. The political skills required for this type of complex manoeuvring suggest that Cerdic possessed not just military talent, but also sophisticated understanding of the British political landscape and the cultural knowledge necessary to communicate effectively with Celtic-speaking populations. As Cerdic consolidated his position along the Hampshire coast and prepared for the campaigns that would establish his kingdom, he could hardly have imagined that his landing at Cerdicesora would be remembered more than 15 centuries later as one of the foundational moments in English history. Yet the strategic vision, military skill, and political acumen that he demonstrated in these early campaigns would establish patterns of leadership and governance that would influence the development of Wessex for generations to come. The landing at Cerdicesora represents more than just another episode in the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain. It marks the beginning of a new phase in the complex process of cultural and political transformation that would eventually create the unified English kingdom. Cerdic's success in establishing himself as an independent ruler in this strategic location would have profound consequences not just for his immediate followers, but for the broader course of British and European history. The years immediately following Cerdic's landing at Cerdicesora were marked by a series of carefully planned military campaigns designed to transform a precarious beachhead into a secure territorial base. Unlike the hit-and-run raiding that characterised much early Saxon activity in Britain, Cerdic's operations showed clear strategic vision and sophisticated understanding of the political and military landscape he sought to conquer. His campaigns during the final years of the 5th century established the foundational territory of what would become the Kingdom of Wessex, while demonstrating the military and political skills that would make him one of the most successful leaders of his generation. The strategic situation that Cerdic faced after his initial landing was both challenging and full of opportunity. His small force, numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, was surrounded by potentially hostile British populations and faced the possibility of coordinated resistance from established regional rulers. Yet the political fragmentation of post-Roman Britain also created numerous opportunities for an ambitious and skilled leader to exploit divisions among his opponents and build coalitions with potential allies. The first phase of Cerdic's territorial expansion probably focused on securing the immediate vicinity of his landing site and establishing reliable supply lines to support further operations. This would have involved a combination of military action against hostile forces, diplomatic negotiations with neutral or potentially friendly populations, and the establishment of fortified positions that could serve as bases for future campaigns. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests that Cerdic's forces quickly moved beyond simple military occupation to begin the complex process of territorial administration and cultural integration. Excavations at sites throughout Hampshire and the surrounding regions reveal changes in material culture, settlement patterns, and burial practices that indicate the establishment of Saxon political control alongside continued British population presence. The continuation of many Romano-British cultural practices alongside new Saxon elements suggests that Cerdic's approach to conquest was more nuanced than simple military domination. Rather than attempting to completely replace existing populations and cultural systems, he appears to have worked to integrate Saxon military and political leadership with existing British social and economic structures. This approach would have been both practically necessary, given the relatively small size of his initial force, and strategically wise, as it would have minimised resistance while maximising the productive capacity of conquered territories. The first major military challenge that Cerdic faced was probably the need to deal with organised British resistance led by regional kings or war leaders. The Chronicle's reference to immediate fighting upon his landing suggests that local British authorities were both well informed about Saxon activities and prepared to respond quickly to new threats. These early conflicts would have tested not only Cerdic's military capabilities, but also his ability to maintain the loyalty and morale of his followers in the face of determined opposition. The tactics that Cerdic employed during these early campaigns can be inferred from broader patterns of Saxon warfare during this period and from the geographical and political constraints he faced. His forces probably relied heavily on mobility and surprise, using their knowledge of Roman road networks and river systems to move quickly between targets while avoiding concentrations of enemy forces that might overwhelm his relatively small army. The famous Saxon battle tactics of this period combined Germanic warrior traditions with innovations borrowed from Roman military practice. Saxon warriors typically fought in closely packed formations that emphasized mutual support and collective discipline rather than individual heroics. The front ranks would be equipped with large shields and long spears, creating a formidable defensive barrier that could also advance aggressively against enemy positions. Behind this shield wall, warriors armed with the characteristic Saxon seax, a large single-edged knife, would exploit gaps in enemy formations to devastating effect. But Cerdic's military success probably depended as much on political and diplomatic skills as on tactical prowess. The complex ethnic and political landscape of late 5th century Britain required leaders who could navigate competing loyalties, cultural differences, and changing alliance patterns. A purely military approach to conquest would have been unlikely to succeed against the combined resistance of British populations who could draw on centuries of experience in organised warfare and territorial defence. Instead, Cerdic appears to have employed a sophisticated strategy that combined military pressure with diplomatic incentives to gradually extend his control over larger and larger territories. This approach would have involved careful assessment of local political situations, selective use of military force against key opponents, and generous treatment of populations and leaders willing to accept Saxon overlordship peacefully. The process of establishing Saxon control over British territories was facilitated by the existing social and economic structures that had developed during the Roman period. The Roman system of civitates, territorial units organised around urban centres, provided a ready-made framework for political administration that could be adapted to Saxon needs. Similarly, the Roman road network, agricultural estates, and trading relationships could be maintained and exploited by Saxon rulers who understood their value. Cerdic's apparent familiarity with these Roman-era institutions suggests either that he had significant prior experience in Britain, or that he received advice from local populations who understood how to work within existing systems. This institutional continuity would have provided significant advantages in establishing effective governance over conquered territories, while minimizing the disruption that might have provoked sustained resistance. The question of how Cerdic managed to maintain the loyalty of his original Saxon followers, while simultaneously attracting additional supporters from diverse ethnic backgrounds, is crucial for understanding his success during this period. Saxon warrior culture placed enormous emphasis on personal loyalty between leaders and followers, reinforced by regular distribution of wealth gained through successful military campaigns. But building a lasting kingdom required more than just military success. It demanded the creation of stable political institutions that could survive the death of individual leaders. Cerdic's solution to this challenge appears to have involved the gradual transformation of his warband from a purely military organisation into the core of a territorial aristocracy. His original followers were probably granted lands conquered during his campaigns, transforming them from dependent warriors into local administrators with their own economic interests in maintaining Saxon rule. This process would have created powerful incentives for loyalty, while also providing the human resources necessary for effective territorial governance. The integration of British populations into this emerging Saxon political system was probably achieved through a combination of co-optation and coercion. British aristocrats who submitted peacefully to Saxon overlordship might have been allowed to retain their lands and local authority in exchange for tribute and military service. British commoners would have found their daily lives relatively unchanged, as they simply transferred their obligations from British to Saxon lords. Only those who actively resisted Saxon expansion would have faced the full consequences of military defeat. This pragmatic approach to conquest and governance helps explain how Cerdic was able to establish effective control over territories far larger than his initial military force should have been able to dominate through purely military means. By working within existing social and economic structures rather than attempting to replace them entirely, he minimized resistance while maximizing the productive capacity of his expanding domain. The geographical scope of Cerdic's early campaigns reveals careful strategic planning designed to secure the most valuable and defensible territories in southern Britain. His forces moved systematically to control key river valleys, important road junctions, and fortified positions that could serve as bases for further expansion. This methodical approach suggests military leadership that understood the importance of secure communications, reliable supply lines, and defensible positions in maintaining control over conquered territories. The rivers of Hampshire and the surrounding regions provided natural highways that allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies, while also serving as defensive barriers against enemy counterattacks. Control of these waterways would have given Cerdic's forces significant advantages in terms of mobility and logistics, allowing them to concentrate superior numbers at crucial points while avoiding being trapped by larger enemy forces. The Roman road network, though deteriorating after decades of reduced maintenance, still provided the most efficient means of long-distance travel and communication in early medieval Britain. Cerdic's apparent familiarity with these routes and his ability to use them effectively suggests either extensive prior knowledge of British geography or excellent intelligence-gathering capabilities. Either way, this knowledge of the landscape provided crucial advantages in planning and executing military campaigns. The fortified positions that Cerdic established during his early campaigns served multiple purposes beyond simple military defence. They provided secure bases for his followers, storage facilities for captured wealth and supplies, and symbols of Saxon authority that could impress both allies and enemies. The location and construction of these fortifications reveal sophisticated understanding of military engineering and strategic planning that went far beyond the capabilities of simple raiding leaders. Archaeological evidence from Saxon fortifications of this period shows interesting combinations of Germanic military traditions with Roman engineering techniques. Earthwork defences were reinforced with stone walls where materials were available, while internal layouts often followed Roman models for military camps and administrative centres. This architectural fusion reflects the broader cultural synthesis that characterised Cerdic's approach to conquest and governance. The economic foundations of Cerdic's expanding domain were probably established during these early campaigns through a combination of tribute collection, direct control of productive resources, and the development of trading relationships with neighbouring territories. The wealth generated through these activities would have been essential for maintaining the loyalty of his followers, attracting additional recruits, and funding the military campaigns necessary for further territorial expansion. The agricultural estates that formed the backbone of the Romano-British economy could be maintained and exploited by Saxon rulers who understood their organisation and productive capacity. The skilled craftsmen, traders, and administrators who had served British rulers could transfer their allegiance to Saxon lords who offered security and stability. The trading networks that connected Britain to continental markets could be maintained and expanded by leaders who controlled key ports and transportation routes. The gradual nature of Saxon territorial expansion during this period allowed for the development of stable administrative systems that could survive temporary military setbacks or leadership changes. Unlike conquests achieved through single decisive campaigns, Cerdic's methodical approach created multiple layers of control and numerous opportunities for integrating conquered populations into his expanding political system. The cultural implications of this gradual conquest were profound and long-lasting. Rather than creating sharp divisions between conqueror and conquered, Cerdic's approach encouraged cultural mixing and adaptation that would characterise Anglo-Saxon England for centuries to come. Saxon military and political traditions merged with British social customs, Christian religious practices, and Roman administrative techniques to create distinctive regional cultures that combined elements from all these sources. The linguistic changes that occurred during this period reflect this complex process of cultural integration. While Saxon languages gradually became dominant in most conquered territories, they incorporated significant numbers of British and Latin loanwords that reflected ongoing contact between different linguistic communities. Place names similarly show complex patterns of Saxon replacement and British survival that varied according to local political and demographic conditions. The religious landscape that Cerdic encountered during his campaigns was equally complex, with Christian British populations, pagan Saxon settlers, and probably significant numbers of people whose religious practices combined elements from both traditions. A successful conqueror needed to navigate these religious differences carefully, avoiding policies that might provoke unnecessary resistance, while maintaining the loyalty of followers with different religious commitments. The evidence suggests that Cerdic adopted a pragmatic approach to religious questions that prioritised political stability over doctrinal consistency. Christian British populations who submitted peacefully to Saxon overlordship were probably allowed to maintain their religious practices and clerical leadership. Pagan Saxon followers were similarly allowed to continue their traditional religious observances. Only religious activities that posed direct political threats would have been suppressed or redirected. This religious tolerance, while probably motivated more by political necessity than genuine pluralistic values, created conditions for the gradual cultural synthesis that would characterise early medieval England. Christian and pagan religious practices influenced each other in complex ways, creating syncretic forms of belief and ritual that combined elements from both traditions. These religious innovations would later provide important foundations for the eventual Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England. The military innovations that emerged from Cerdic's campaigns would influence Saxon warfare for generations to come. The combination of Germanic warrior traditions with Roman tactical knowledge created new forms of military organisation that were both effective in battle and suitable for territorial governance. The warrior aristocracy that developed around Cerdic's court would serve as a model for similar institutions throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The political institutions that Cerdic established during his early campaigns similarly provided templates that would be adapted and modified by later Saxon rulers. The balance between personal loyalty and institutional authority, the integration of conquered populations, and the development of stable territorial administration all became characteristic features of Anglo-Saxon political culture. As Cerdic's forces consolidated their control over the territories conquered during these early campaigns, they were laying the foundations not just for the Kingdom of Wessex, but for many of the distinctive features of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The pragmatic flexibility, cultural adaptability, and institutional innovation that characterized these formative years would become defining characteristics of English political and social development for centuries to come. The year 508 CE marked a crucial turning point in Cerdic's conquest of southern Britain, when his forces encountered and defeated a formidable British army led by a king named Natanleod. This engagement, which came to be known as the Battle of Natanleaga, represented the first major test of Saxon military prowess against organised British resistance and established Cerdic as a dominant force in the complex political landscape of early 6th century England. The battle's aftermath would reshape the territorial map of southern Britain and demonstrate the effectiveness of Cerdic's military and political strategies. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the battle resulted in a devastating defeat for the British forces, with Natanleod himself killed along with 5,000 of his warriors. While these numbers should be treated with caution, medieval chroniclers frequently exaggerated casualty figures for dramatic effect. The scale of the reported victory suggests a significant military engagement that eliminated a major threat to Saxon expansion and opened new territories for conquest. The identity of Natanleod himself remains something of a historical mystery, though his name suggests he was a British ruler of considerable importance and military capability. The Celtic name Natanleod appears to mean battle brave or war leader, indicating either his personal reputation for military prowess or his official role as a war chief responsible for coordinating British resistance to Saxon expansion. His ability to field such a large army suggests that he commanded the loyalty of multiple tribal groups or territories, making him a formidable opponent for Cerdic's relatively small Saxon force. The location of the battle, identified in later sources as Natanleaga and associated with modern Netley near Southampton, provides important clues about the strategic situation that led to this crucial engagement. This area represents a natural choke point between the Hampshire coast and the interior valleys that provided access to the Upper Thames region and the heartland of southern Britain. Control of this territory would have been essential for any Saxon leader seeking to expand beyond the coastal regions where they had initially established themselves. For Natanleod, the strategic imperative was probably to prevent Saxon expansion inland before it could gain sufficient momentum to become unstoppable. The concentration of such a large British force in this location suggests a coordinated effort by multiple British rulers to contain Saxon territorial growth while it remained manageable. The defeat of this army would have eliminated organised British resistance throughout a wide area and opened the way for rapid Saxon expansion. The tactical details of the battle itself can only be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence and general knowledge of early medieval warfare, but several factors probably contributed to Cerdic's decisive victory. Saxon military organisation and tactics had evolved significantly since the early phases of Germanic settlement in Britain, incorporating lessons learned from decades of campaigning against British opponents while maintaining the distinctive warrior culture that gave Saxon armies their cohesion and fighting spirit. The Saxon shield wall, which had become the dominant tactical formation in Germanic warfare, was particularly effective against British fighting methods that emphasised individual combat skills and cavalry charges. The closely packed formation of Saxon warriors, protected by overlapping shields and armed with long spears, could absorb the shock of cavalry attacks while maintaining cohesion for counterattacks with the deadly Saxon sayax. This tactical system required extensive training and discipline, but provided significant advantages against less organised opponents. Cerdic's forces probably also benefited from superior logistics and strategic mobility that allowed them to choose the time and place of battle to their advantage. Their control of coastal bases provided secure supply lines and opportunities for tactical withdrawal if the battle went badly. Their familiarity with local terrain, acquired during more than a decade of campaigning in the region, would have allowed them to select positions that maximised their tactical advantages while minimising British strengths. The psychological impact of this decisive victory extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For Cerdic's Saxon followers, the defeat of such a formidable British army proved the effectiveness of their military system and the wisdom of their leaders' strategic vision. This success would have attracted additional recruits from among Saxon populations throughout southern Britain while cementing the loyalty of existing followers through the distribution of captured wealth and territory. For British populations throughout the region, Natanleod's defeat represented a catastrophic failure of organised resistance that probably led many local rulers to reconsider their options. The demonstration of Saxon military superiority would have encouraged some British leaders to seek accommodation with Cerdic rather than face similar destruction. Others may have concluded that effective resistance required different strategies, leading to changes in British military organisation and tactical approaches. The territorial consequences of the victory were immediate and substantial. The Chronicle records that the land, as far as Charford, was named Netley, in honour of the fallen British king, suggesting that Saxon control was extended over a wide area previously under British authority. This territorial expansion provided Cerdic with the resources necessary to support further military campaigns while establishing his reputation as a successful conqueror who could deliver tangible benefits to his followers. The naming of the conquered territory after the defeated British king reflects an interesting aspect of Saxon cultural practices that combined respect for worthy opponents with celebration of military victory. This practice may have been intended to honour Natanleod's courage in battle while simultaneously establishing Saxon authority over his former domains. Such cultural gestures could serve important political purposes by demonstrating Saxon magnanimity toward defeated enemies, while encouraging future opponents to surrender rather than face destruction. The economic implications of controlling this expanded territory were equally significant. The region between the Hampshire coast and the Thames Valley included some of the most productive agricultural land in southern Britain, along with important transportation routes that connected different regions of the country. Control of these resources would have provided Cerdic with the wealth necessary to maintain his expanding army while attracting additional supporters through the promise of land grants and economic opportunities. The battle also established important precedents for Saxon approaches to conquest and governance that would influence their subsequent expansion throughout Britain. The combination of decisive military action against organised resistance with generous treatment of populations willing to submit peacefully created a model that balanced intimidation with incentives. This approach would prove highly effective in extending Saxon control over diverse populations with varying levels of commitment to resistance. The political ramifications of Natanleod's defeat extended throughout the complex network of alliances and rivalries that characterised early 6th century Britain. Other British rulers would have needed to reassess their strategic positions in light of this demonstration of Saxon military capability. Some may have sought to form new alliances to replace the protection previously provided by Natanleod's forces. Others might have decided to negotiate with Cerdic from positions of strength, while they still retained significant military capabilities. The victory also enhanced Cerdic's position within the broader Saxon political community. Success against such a formidable British opponent would have increased his prestige among other Saxon leaders while demonstrating the potential rewards of supporting his campaigns. This enhanced reputation would have been valuable in recruiting warriors, negotiating alliances, and establishing diplomatic relationships with other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The religious dimensions of the battle, while not explicitly documented in surviving sources, were probably significant for both Saxon and British participants. For pagan Saxon warriors, victory in such a major engagement would have been seen as evidence of divine favour and the power of their traditional war gods. For Christian British populations, the defeat might have been interpreted as divine punishment for sins, or as a test of faith that required spiritual renewal and reform. The long-term historical significance of the Battle of Natanleaga extends far beyond its immediate military and political consequences. The victory established Cerdic as the dominant power in southern Britain and cleared the way for the territorial expansion that would create the Kingdom of Wessex. More broadly, it demonstrated the effectiveness of Saxon military and political methods in the challenging environment of post-Roman Britain. The battle also marked an important stage in the complex process of cultural transformation that would eventually create Anglo-Saxon England. The decisive nature of Saxon victory, combined with their pragmatic approach to governing conquered populations, accelerated the integration of Germanic and British cultural elements that would characterise English civilization for centuries to come. As news of the great victory spread throughout Britain and across the English Channel to Germanic homelands, Cerdic's reputation as a successful military leader and effective ruler attracted additional followers who would participate in the final phases of his conquest campaigns. The Battle of Natanleaga had transformed him from a regional war leader into a figure of national significance whose actions would shape the future of English history. The path from successful war leader to acknowledged king required more than military prowess alone. It demanded the ability to transform battlefield victories into lasting political institutions, personal loyalty into territorial authority, and temporary conquest into permanent governance. For Cerdic, this crucial transformation reached its culmination in 519 CE at a place the Anglo-Saxon chronicle calls Cerdicesford, where he and his son Cynric obtained the kingdom of the West Saxons and established the royal dynasty that would rule Wessex for centuries to come. The significance of this moment extended far beyond the formal assumption of royal titles. The establishment of the West Saxon kingdom represented the successful, conclusion of more than 2 decades of careful military and political manoeuvring that had gradually transformed a small Saxon warband into the dominant power in southern Britain. The choice of 519 CE for this royal proclamation was almost certainly deliberate, timed to coincide with military and political developments that made such a declaration both practical and symbolically appropriate. The location of Cerdicesford, identified by modern historians with Charford on the River Avon, was strategically significant for several reasons. The site controlled an important river crossing that connected the territories Cerdic had conquered along the Hampshire coast with the Upper Thames Valley regions that were crucial for further expansion. Control of this crossing point would have given Saxon forces the ability to move rapidly between different parts of their domain, while denying the same advantage to potential enemies. More importantly, the location represented a symbolic boundary between the coastal territories, where Saxon settlement was already well established, and the interior regions where British political authority remained strong. By choosing this frontier location for his royal proclamation, Cerdic was making a clear statement about his intentions to extend Saxon control throughout southern Britain, while establishing his credentials as a leader capable of achieving such ambitious objectives. The process by which Cerdic transformed himself from war leader to king reflects broader patterns of political development throughout early medieval Europe. The institution of kingship in Germanic societies was not simply inherited or imposed, but had to be actively constructed through the demonstration of military success, the accumulation of wealth and followers, and the establishment of governmental institutions that could function independently of the king's personal presence. The warrior band that had followed Cerdic from his initial landing at Cerdicesora had evolved significantly during the intervening decades. What began as a relatively small group of professional warriors bound together by personal loyalty and the promise of adventure had grown into a complex political and military organisation capable of governing substantial territories and diverse populations. This transformation required new forms of leadership, administration, and social organisation that went far beyond traditional Germanic tribal structures. The assumption of royal authority also required the development of new relationships with existing Saxon populations in southern Britain. Many of these communities had been established for several generations and had developed their own local leaders, customs, and territorial claims. Cerdic's success in uniting these diverse Saxon groups under his royal authority demonstrates remarkable political skills that complemented his well-documented military capabilities. The integration of conquered British populations into this emerging Saxon kingdom presented even greater challenges. Unlike the relatively straightforward process of asserting authority over fellow Saxons, who shared similar cultural backgrounds and political expectations, ruling British subjects required sensitivity to different languages, legal traditions, religious practices, and social customs. The apparent success of this integration process suggests that Cerdic possessed the cultural flexibility and administrative wisdom necessary for effective multi-ethnic governance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's statement that, "From that day have reigned the children of the West Saxon kings," emphasises the dynastic significance of the 519 CE proclamation. The establishment of hereditary royal authority represented a fundamental departure from earlier Saxon political practices that emphasised elected war leaders and temporary military commands. This institutional innovation would have profound consequences for the development of Anglo-Saxon political culture and the eventual unification of England under West Saxon leadership. The presence of Cynric alongside Cerdic during this royal proclamation highlights the importance of dynastic succession in legitimising the new kingdom. By associating his son with the assumption of royal authority, Cerdic was establishing precedents for peaceful succession that would help ensure the stability of his newly founded dynasty. This forward-thinking approach to political organisation demonstrates strategic vision that extended far beyond immediate military objectives. The military engagement that accompanied the royal proclamation at Cerdicesford was probably intended to demonstrate Saxon military superiority and discourage potential challenges to the new royal authority. The Chronicle's reference to fighting against the Britons suggests that organised British resistance continued even after the devastating defeat at Natanleaga, indicating the resilience of British political and military institutions despite repeated Saxon victories. The tactical details of this engagement are not preserved in surviving sources, but it probably followed patterns established during Cerdic's earlier campaigns. Saxon forces would have relied on their superior organisation, discipline, and tactical coordination to defeat British opponents who might have enjoyed numerical advantages but lacked equivalent military cohesion. The outcome of this battle would have been crucial for establishing the credibility of Cerdic's royal claims among both Saxon followers and British subjects. The choice of the royal title, King of the West Saxons, rather than simply King of Wessex, reflects important aspects of early medieval political thinking. The ethnic designation emphasised the Germanic identity of the ruling dynasty, while implicitly acknowledging the multi-ethnic character of the territories under Saxon control. This title allowed Cerdic to maintain the loyalty of Saxon populations who valued their cultural identity, while avoiding unnecessarily provocative assertions of authority over British populations who might accept Saxon political control without embracing Saxon ethnic identity. The governmental institutions that Cerdic established to support his royal authority probably combined Germanic traditions of warrior leadership with Roman administrative practices that had survived the collapse of imperial government. This institutional synthesis would have been necessary for governing the complex territorial and demographic situation that characterised early 6th century southern Britain. The royal court that developed around Cerdic would have served multiple functions beyond simple political administration. It provided a centre for military planning and coordination that allowed Saxon forces to respond quickly to threats or opportunities throughout their expanding domain. It served as a focus for diplomatic relationships with neighbouring kingdoms and a symbol of Saxon political authority that could impress both allies and enemies. The economic foundations of royal authority required the development of reliable revenue sources that could support the military forces, administrative personnel, and ceremonial activities associated with kingship. These resources probably came from a combination of tribute payments from conquered territories, direct control of productive land, regulation of trade and commerce, and the proceeds from successful military campaigns. The legal and judicial functions of royal authority represented another crucial aspect of Cerdic's political innovation. The establishment of royal courts capable of resolving disputes, enforcing contracts, and maintaining public order would have been essential for the effective governance of diverse populations with different legal traditions. The development of these institutional capabilities demonstrates the sophistication of early Saxon political organisation. The religious dimensions of royal authority, while not explicitly documented in surviving sources, were probably significant for both the legitimacy of Cerdic's rule and the integration of different religious communities within his kingdom. As a pagan ruler governing both Saxon and British Christian populations, Cerdic would have needed to navigate complex religious politics that could either strengthen or undermine his political position. The international implications of establishing the West Saxon kingdom extended throughout the complex network of relationships that connected early medieval Britain to continental Europe. Other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would have needed to reassess their strategic positions in light of this new political reality. Continental Germanic rulers might have seen opportunities for alliance or trade with the successful new kingdom. Even distant powers like the Frankish kingdom or the Byzantine Empire might have taken notice of political developments that could affect broader European political and military balances. The cultural significance of Cerdic's royal proclamation extended far beyond its immediate political consequences. The successful establishment of a stable Saxon kingdom in southern Britain demonstrated the possibility of creating lasting political institutions that combined Germanic and British elements in new and innovative ways. This achievement would provide both inspiration and practical models for similar developments throughout early medieval Europe. The transformation of Cerdic from war leader to king represents one of the most successful examples of political entrepreneurship in early medieval history. His ability to combine military prowess with political wisdom, cultural sensitivity with strategic vision, and personal charisma with institutional innovation created a kingdom that would endure for centuries and ultimately provide the foundation for the unification of England. As Cerdic assumed the full authority and responsibilities of royal power at Cerdicesford in 519 CE, he was establishing precedents and institutions that would influence English political development for generations to come. The kingdom he founded would face numerous challenges and undergo significant changes, but the basic framework of royal authority, territorial organisation, and multi-ethnic governance that he established would provide the foundation for all subsequent developments in West Saxon and eventually English political history. The decade following Cerdic's assumption of royal authority in 519 CE represented a crucial period of consolidation and institutional development that transformed the nascent West Saxon kingdom from a successful military enterprise into a stable political entity capable of long-term survival and growth. These years, often overlooked in dramatic narratives that focus on military campaigns and territorial conquest, were actually decisive in establishing the governmental structures, economic foundations, and cultural institutions that would characterize Wessex for centuries to come. The challenges facing any newly established kingdom in early 6th century Britain were immense and multifaceted. Military threats remained constant, as neighbouring British and Saxon rulers sought to exploit any signs of weakness or distraction. Economic stability required the development of reliable revenue sources and the maintenance of productive agricultural and commercial activities across territories that had experienced decades of warfare and political disruption. Social cohesion demanded the integration of diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds, legal traditions, and political expectations into a unified political community. Perhaps most importantly, the new kingdom needed to develop institutional mechanisms that could function effectively even during periods of royal absence, illness, or disputed succession. The Germanic tradition of personal loyalty between war leaders and their followers provided a solid foundation for military organization, but governing complex territories with diverse populations required more sophisticated administrative systems that could operate independently of the king's direct personal involvement. Cerdic's approach to these challenges demonstrated remarkable political wisdom and strategic vision. Rather than attempting to impose uniform Saxon customs and institutions throughout his domains, he developed flexible governmental systems that could accommodate local variations while maintaining overall royal authority. This pragmatic approach to political organisation would become a characteristic feature of successful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and would contribute significantly to their long-term stability and effectiveness. The territorial organisation of the early West Saxon kingdom probably reflected this same pragmatic flexibility. Rather than attempting to govern all conquered territories through direct royal administration, Cerdic appears to have developed a hierarchical system that delegated significant authority to local leaders while maintaining ultimate royal control over military, judicial, and fiscal matters. This approach allowed for efficient governance of large territories while minimizing the administrative burden on the royal court. The warrior aristocracy that had developed around Cerdic during his conquest campaigns provided the human resources for this territorial administration. His original followers, rewarded with grants of conquered land, became the local administrators responsible for maintaining Saxon authority throughout the kingdom. This transformation of warriors into landed aristocrats created powerful incentives for loyalty, while providing the expertise necessary for effective local governance. The integration of British populations into this emerging Saxon political system was probably achieved through a careful balance of co-optation and coercion. British aristocrats who submitted peacefully to Saxon overlordship might have been allowed to retain significant local authority in exchange for tribute payments and military service. British commoners probably found their daily lives relatively unchanged, as they simply transferred their obligations from British to Saxon lords, while continuing to work the same lands and follow many of the same customs. The economic foundations of the West Saxon kingdom during this period were based primarily on agriculture, but also included significant commercial and military components. The fertile lands of Hampshire, Wiltshire, and the Thames Valley provided the agricultural surplus necessary to support non-productive populations, including warriors, administrators, and craftsmen. The control of important transportation routes, particularly river crossings and road junctions, generated revenue through tolls and trading fees, while facilitating the movement of goods and information throughout the kingdom. The military organisation that Cerdic established during these consolidation years would serve as a model for Anglo-Saxon kingdoms throughout Britain. The system combined professional warriors maintained at the royal court with local militia forces that could be mobilised for specific campaigns or defensive operations. This approach provided the kingdom with both rapid response capabilities for dealing with immediate threats and the ability to field large armies for major military undertakings. The professional warrior class that formed the core of this military system was supported through a combination of royal grants, tribute payments, and the proceeds from successful campaigns. These warriors served not only as soldiers, but also as administrators, diplomats, and symbols of royal authority throughout the kingdom. Their presence in local communities provided both security and visible reminders of royal power that helped maintain political stability. The legal and judicial institutions that developed during this period probably combined Germanic customary law with Roman legal traditions that had survived the collapse of imperial administration. This synthesis created distinctive legal systems that could address the complex social and economic relationships that characterized early medieval society, while maintaining consistency with broader Anglo-Saxon legal traditions. The development of royal courts capable of resolving disputes and enforcing legal decisions was crucial for maintaining social order and economic stability throughout the kingdom. These courts provided forums for resolving conflicts between different ethnic communities, establishing property rights, enforcing contracts, and maintaining public order. The effectiveness of these judicial institutions would have been essential for the successful integration of diverse populations into the Saxon political system. The religious landscape of the early West Saxon kingdom was complex and politically sensitive. Cerdic himself was probably pagan, following traditional Germanic religious practices that emphasized warrior gods and heroic values. However, significant portions of his British subjects were Christian, following religious traditions that had been established during the Roman period and had survived the collapse of imperial administration. Cerdic's approach to these religious differences appears to have been pragmatically tolerant, avoiding policies that might provoke unnecessary resistance while maintaining the loyalty of his pagan Saxon followers. Christian British populations were probably allowed to continue their religious practices and maintain their clerical leadership as long as they accepted Saxon political authority. This religious tolerance, while motivated primarily by political considerations, created conditions for the eventual peaceful Christianization of the Saxon population. The cultural developments that occurred during this consolidation period were equally significant for the long-term character of the West Saxon kingdom. The interaction between Saxon and British populations created new forms of material culture, artistic expression, and social organisation that combined elements from both traditions. These cultural innovations would become characteristic features of Anglo-Saxon civilization and would influence English cultural development for centuries to come. The linguistic changes that accompanied political consolidation were particularly important. While Saxon languages gradually became dominant throughout most of the kingdom, they incorporated significant numbers of British and Latin loanwords that reflected ongoing cultural interaction. Similarly, place names throughout the kingdom show complex patterns of Saxon replacement and British survival that varied according to local demographic and political conditions. The development of trading relationships with neighbouring kingdoms and continental territories was another crucial aspect of economic consolidation during this period. Control of important ports and transportation routes allowed West Saxon merchants to participate in the commercial networks that connected Britain to European markets. These trading relationships provided sources of exotic goods that could be used to reward followers and impress allies while generating revenue for royal administration. The diplomatic relationships that Cerdic established with neighbouring rulers were equally important for the kingdom's long-term security and prosperity. The complex web of alliances, rivalries, and mutual obligations that characterized early medieval politics required constant attention and sophisticated diplomatic skills. Success in these diplomatic endeavours could provide military allies, trading partners, and marriage connections that strengthened the kingdom's position within the broader political landscape of early medieval Britain. The educational and cultural institutions that began to develop during this period would have long-term significance for Saxon political and social development. While formal educational systems were probably limited, the royal court would have served as a centre for cultural exchange and intellectual development. The presence of British subjects with Latin literacy and Christian learning, combined with Saxon oral traditions and Germanic cultural practices, created opportunities for cultural synthesis that would enrich Anglo-Saxon civilization. The architectural and artistic developments of this period reflected the growing wealth and sophistication of the West Saxon kingdom. Royal and aristocratic residences became larger and more elaborate, incorporating both Germanic and Roman design elements. Craftsmen working in metal, wood, and stone created distinctive artistic styles that combined traditional Saxon motifs with influences drawn from British and continental sources. The military architecture that developed during this period was particularly significant for the kingdom's defensive capabilities. Fortified positions were established at strategic locations throughout the kingdom, providing bases for military operations while serving as symbols of Saxon authority. These fortifications often incorporated existing Roman defensive works, while adding distinctly Saxon modifications that reflected changing military techniques and strategic requirements. As the consolidation period drew to a close, Cerdic had successfully transformed his military conquest into a stable kingdom capable of surviving the challenges that would inevitably arise in the complex political environment of early medieval Britain. The institutions he established, the precedents he set, and the cultural foundations he laid would provide the framework for centuries of West Saxon political and social development. The kingdom that emerged from this consolidation process was distinctly different from the warband that had landed at Cerdicesora in 495 CE. It was a sophisticated political entity capable of governing diverse populations, maintaining complex economic relationships, and competing effectively with other major powers in early medieval Europe. Most importantly, it had developed the institutional resilience necessary to survive changes in leadership, external threats, and internal challenges that would test its strength in the years to come. In 530 CE, 16 years after assuming royal authority and 35 years after his initial landing in Britain, Cerdic launched what would prove to be one of his most strategically significant military campaigns, the conquest of the Isle of Wight. This island, known to the Saxons as Wight, and to later generations as Vectors, had remained under British control throughout the first phase of Saxon expansion in southern England. Its eventual incorporation into the West Saxon kingdom represented not merely another territorial acquisition, but a crucial strategic victory that secured Cerdic's southern flank, while demonstrating the military sophistication and political ambitions that would characterize his mature reign. The Isle of Wight occupied a position of exceptional strategic importance in the complex military and political geography of early 6th century Britain. Separated from the mainland by the narrow waters of the Solent, the island controlled the approaches to Southampton Water and the river systems that provided access to the interior of southern England. Any power that controlled the island could potentially dominate maritime traffic through this crucial waterway while denying the same advantage to potential enemies. For British rulers, the Isle of Wight represented one of the last remaining strongholds of Celtic political authority in a region increasingly dominated by Saxon kingdoms. The island's natural defences, provided by the surrounding waters, had allowed British populations to maintain their independence even as Saxon control expanded throughout the adjacent mainland territories. This resistance was not merely symbolic. The island served as a potential base for British military operations and a refuge for British leaders displaced by Saxon expansion elsewhere. From Cerdic's perspective, the continued British control of the Isle of Wight represented both a strategic vulnerability and an opportunity for further expansion. As long as British forces controlled the island, they posed a potential threat to Saxon territories along the Hampshire coast, and could potentially serve as a base for coordinated British resistance efforts. The conquest of the island would eliminate this threat while providing new territories for distribution to Saxon followers and new revenues for royal administration. The military challenges involved in conquering the Isle of Wight were substantially different from those Cerdic had faced during his earlier mainland campaigns. The island's natural defences meant that any Saxon assault would require significant naval capabilities and sophisticated amphibious tactics. Unlike mainland campaigns where Saxon forces could rely on their superior mobility and knowledge of local terrain, the conquest of the Isle of Wight demanded careful planning, specialised equipment, and coordination between land and sea forces. The Saxon military system that Cerdic had developed during his previous campaigns was primarily designed for land warfare, emphasising the famous shield wall tactics that had proven so effective against British cavalry and infantry formations. Adapting these proven military methods to the requirements of amphibious operations would have required significant innovations in tactics, equipment, and logistics that demonstrated the continued evolution of Saxon military capabilities under royal leadership. The naval resources necessary for the Isle of Wight campaign probably required substantial preparation and investment. Saxon ships of this period were primarily designed for coastal navigation and troop transport, rather than major military operations. The vessels needed for a successful assault on the island would have needed to be larger, more heavily armed, and more numerous than those used for Cerdic's initial arrival in Britain 3 decades earlier. The sources suggest that Cerdic was joined in this campaign by his son Cynric. indicating that the conquest of the Isle of Wight was viewed as a royal enterprise of particular importance that warranted the personal participation of both the king and his designated successor. This joint leadership arrangement would have served multiple purposes, demonstrating the continued vigour of royal military leadership, providing Cynric with additional experience in major military operations, and symbolising the dynastic continuity that would ensure the kingdom's stability after Cerdic's eventual death. The tactical approach to the island's conquest can only be inferred from general knowledge of early medieval amphibious warfare and the geographical constraints imposed by the island's topography. Saxon forces would have needed to secure suitable landing sites while avoiding the most heavily fortified positions that British defenders would have prepared to resist invasion. The element of surprise would have been crucial, as British forces could have concentrated their limited resources to devastating effect if they had been able to predict the time and location of Saxon landings. The Chronicle's reference to killing a few men at Carisbrooke suggests that the main British defensive position was located at or near the site of the later medieval castle, which occupies a commanding position in the centre of the island. This location would have provided British defenders with excellent observation of potential landing sites while serving as a central stronghold that could coordinate defensive operations throughout the island. The relatively light casualties mentioned in the Chronicle, a few men rather than the thousands reported for earlier battles, might indicate either that British resistance was less determined than expected, or that Saxon tactics were particularly effective in neutralising defensive positions. Alternatively, the phrase might reflect Saxon propaganda that minimised the costs of the campaign while emphasising the completeness of their victory. The political implications of the Isle of Wight's conquest extended far beyond its immediate military significance. The successful completion of this challenging amphibious operation demonstrated Saxon military capabilities that would have impressed both allies and enemies throughout Britain, and possibly across the English Channel, in continental Germanic territories. The victory showed that Saxon military power had evolved beyond simple land-based raiding to encompass sophisticated combined operations that could overcome significant geographical obstacles. For British rulers throughout southern England, the fall of the Isle of Wight represented a psychological as well as strategic defeat. The island had been one of their most secure strongholds, and its conquest demonstrated that even the most naturally defended positions could not resist determined Saxon assault. This realisation would have forced British leaders to reconsider their defensive strategies and possibly to seek new forms of accommodation with Saxon rulers. The administrative arrangements that Cerdic established for governing the newly conquered island reveal important aspects of his approach to territorial expansion and political organisation. According to the Chronicle, the island was granted to Stufan Witgar, described as Cerdic's nephews, who had apparently participated in the conquest and were now rewarded with territorial authority. This delegation of administrative responsibility to trusted family members created a system of regional governance that could maintain royal authority while allowing for local adaptation to specific conditions. The choice of family members for this important administrative role reflects the continued importance of kinship networks in Saxon political organisation. By placing the island under the control of his nephews, Cerdic was ensuring that this strategic territory would remain under reliable royal control while providing his extended family with opportunities for advancement and enrichment that would strengthen their loyalty to the dynasty. The economic potential of the Isle of Wight would have been significant for the expanding West Saxon kingdom. The island's agricultural lands, while limited in extent, were fertile and well suited to the mixed farming practices that formed the backbone of early medieval economic life. The island's strategic position also provided opportunities for controlling and taxing maritime trade, generating revenues that could support both local administration and broader royal objectives. The naval implications of controlling the Isle of Wight extended throughout the complex web of relationships that connected early medieval Britain to continental Europe. Saxon control of the island, combined with their existing dominance along the Hampshire coast, gave them effective command of the Solent and its approaches. This maritime control could potentially influence trade relationships, diplomatic communications, and military movements throughout the region. The religious dimensions of the Isle of Wight's conquest were probably significant for both Saxon and British populations. The island had likely been Christian for several centuries, with established religious institutions and clerical leadership that would have needed to be accommodated within the new Saxon political order. Cerdic's approach to these religious questions would have set important precedents for the treatment of Christian populations throughout his expanding kingdom. The cultural changes that followed Saxon conquest of the island probably reflected the same patterns of gradual integration and adaptation that characterised Cerdic's approach elsewhere. Rather than attempting to completely replace British cultural practices, Saxon administrators would have likely worked to integrate the most useful elements of existing systems while gradually introducing Saxon customs and institutions where they provided clear advantages. The military lessons learned during the Isle of Wight campaign would have influenced Saxon tactical development for years to come. The successful completion of this complex amphibious operation demonstrated capabilities that could be applied to other strategic objectives, potentially including operations against British strongholds in Cornwall, Wales, or other regions that had remained outside Saxon control. The diplomatic ramifications of the conquest extended throughout the complex network of alliances and rivalries that characterised early 6th century British politics. Other Saxon kingdoms would have taken note of Cerdic's continued military success and growing territorial power. British rulers would have needed to reassess their strategic positions in light of this latest demonstration of Saxon capabilities. The conquest of the Isle of Wight in 530 CE represented the culmination of Cerdic's territorial expansion and military innovation. It demonstrated the maturation of Saxon military capabilities under royal leadership, while providing the West Saxon kingdom with secure control over one of the most strategically important positions in southern Britain. The successful completion of this challenging campaign would prove to be one of Cerdic's final major military achievements, as his death just 4 years later would bring an end to one of the most successful careers in early Anglo-Saxon history. The years between 530 and 534 CE, spanning from Cerdic's triumphant conquest of the Isle of Wight to his death and the succession of his son Cynric, represented the culmination of one of the most remarkable careers in early medieval European history. During this final period of his reign, Cerdic devoted his energies to consolidating the institutional foundations of the kingdom he had created, while preparing for the dynastic transition that would ensure the survival of his political achievements beyond his own lifetime. By 530 CE, Cerdic had transformed himself from an unknown Saxon war leader into the founder and ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Britain. The territorial extent of his domain stretched from the Hampshire coast to the upper Thames Valley, encompassing some of the most fertile and strategically important lands in southern England. The kingdom's population included both Saxon settlers and British subjects, who had been integrated into a functioning political system that balanced royal authority with local autonomy. The governmental institutions that Cerdic had developed during his reign represented innovative solutions to the complex challenges of ruling diverse populations across extensive territories. The warrior aristocracy that had emerged from his original followers provided both military leadership and administrative expertise, while the integration of British populations had created a stable foundation for long-term political development. These institutional innovations would serve as models for other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and would contribute significantly to the eventual unification of England under royal authority. The economic foundations of the West Saxon kingdom had similarly evolved during Cerdic's reign, from the simple plunder-based economy of a warband to the complex agricultural, commercial and tribute-based system that characterised successful early medieval kingdoms. The kingdom's control of important transportation routes, productive agricultural lands, and strategic coastal positions provided reliable revenue sources that could support royal administration, military forces, and the ceremonial activities that reinforced royal authority. The cultural achievements of Cerdic's reign were perhaps less immediately visible but equally significant for the long-term development of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The synthesis of Saxon and British cultural elements that had occurred under his rule created distinctive forms of material culture, artistic expression, and social organisation that would influence English cultural development for centuries to come. The pragmatic tolerance that had characterised his approach to religious differences had created conditions for cultural exchange and innovation that enriched both Saxon and British traditions. The military innovations that had emerged during Cerdic's campaigns had similarly transformed Saxon warfare from the relatively simple tactics of Germanic tribal raids to the sophisticated combined operations that could conquer fortified positions and conduct complex amphibious assaults. The professional warrior class that had developed around his court provided both immediate military capabilities and the leadership structure for future military operations under his successors. The diplomatic relationships that Cerdic had established with neighbouring rulers represented another crucial aspect of his political legacy. The complex web of alliances, treaties and mutual obligations that connected the West Saxon kingdom to other political entities throughout Britain and continental Europe provided both security against external threats and opportunities for beneficial cooperation in trade, marriage arrangements and military ventures. The dynastic arrangements that Cerdic had made for his succession represented perhaps his most important contribution to the long-term stability of the kingdom he had founded. The gradual integration of his son Cynric into royal responsibilities, demonstrated through their joint leadership of major military campaigns and administrative decisions, had prepared the ground for a smooth transition of power that would avoid the succession crises that destroyed many early medieval kingdoms. The personal qualities that had enabled Cerdic to achieve such remarkable success provide insights into the nature of effective leadership in the complex political environment of post-Roman Britain. His combination of military prowess and political wisdom, cultural sensitivity and strategic vision, personal charisma and institutional innovation had created a unique leadership style that was particularly well suited to the challenges of his era. The military skills that Cerdic had demonstrated throughout his career reflected both traditional Germanic warrior culture and innovative adaptations to the specific conditions of British warfare. His ability to inspire personal loyalty among his followers while maintaining discipline and tactical coordination in battle had enabled Saxon forces to defeat larger and better equipped British armies on numerous occasions. His strategic vision had guided territorial expansion that created defensible boundaries while providing resources for further military operations. The political acumen that Cerdic had shown in dealing with diverse populations and complex diplomatic situations demonstrated intellectual capabilities that complemented his military talents. His pragmatic approach to cultural and religious differences had enabled the successful integration of conquered populations while maintaining the loyalty of his Saxon followers. His understanding of the importance of institutional development had created governmental structures that could function effectively even during periods of royal absence or illness. The cultural flexibility that had characterized Cerdic's approach to conquest and governance reflected sophisticated understanding of the realities of early medieval society. His willingness to adapt Saxon customs and institutions to local conditions while gradually introducing beneficial innovations had created hybrid cultural forms that combined the best elements of both Saxon and British traditions. This cultural synthesis would become a defining characteristic of Anglo-Saxon civilization and would contribute significantly to its long-term success and resilience. As Cerdic entered his final years, he could reflect on achievements that few leaders in any era have equalled. He had created a kingdom from nothing, transformed a small war band into a formidable military and political organization, and established institutional foundations that would endure for centuries. His success had not come without cost. Decades of warfare had brought suffering and displacement to countless individuals and communities, but the stability and prosperity that his kingdom would eventually provide would benefit far more people than had suffered during its creation. The historical significance of Cerdic's achievements extends far beyond the immediate impact of his military and political success. His kingdom would serve as the foundation for the eventual unification of England under West Saxon leadership, while the governmental institutions and cultural innovations that he pioneered would influence English political and social development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The legendary status that Cerdic would achieve in later Anglo-Saxon tradition reflects the recognition of his contemporaries and successors that his accomplishments represented something truly exceptional in the difficult world of early medieval politics. The genealogies that traced the descent of later English kings back to Cerdic, while often historically questionable in their details, accurately reflected his foundational importance for the development of English royal authority and political institutions. The death of Cerdic in 534 CE marked the end of an era in British history. The age of small-scale Saxon settlement and localised British resistance was drawing to a close, replaced by the more organised territorial kingdoms that would dominate British politics for the next several centuries. Cerdic had not only participated in this transformation, he had been one of its primary architects, creating precedents and institutions that would shape the future development of English civilization. The peaceful succession of Cynric to royal authority after his father's death demonstrated the effectiveness of the dynastic arrangements that Cerdic had established during his final years. The kingdom that Cynric inherited was stable, prosperous, and well-positioned for further expansion under competent leadership. The institutional foundations that his father had created would provide the framework for centuries of West Saxon political development and eventual English unification. As we reflect on the extraordinary career of Cerdic, we must acknowledge both his remarkable achievements and the historical limitations that constrain our understanding of his life and times. The sources that preserve his story were written centuries after his death, and reflect the political and cultural concerns of later periods as much as the realities of early 6th century Britain. Yet even allowing for these limitations, the evidence clearly indicates that Cerdic was a figure of exceptional importance, whose actions helped shape the course of British and European history. The kingdom that Cerdic founded would face numerous challenges in the centuries following his death. It would experience periods of weakness and strength, territorial losses and gains, internal conflicts and external threats. But the basic framework of royal authority, territorial organisation, and cultural identity that he had established would provide the foundation for all subsequent developments. When the Kingdom of Wessex finally achieved the unification of England under Alfred the Great and his successors, they would be building on institutional and cultural foundations that traced back to the remarkable achievements of Cerdic, the Saxon warrior who became the founder of a dynasty and the architect of a kingdom that would endure for centuries. The kingdom that emerged from Cerdic's 4 decades of conquest and consolidation represented far more than a simple territorial acquisition or military success. By the time of his death in 534 CE, Wessex had developed into a sophisticated political entity with distinctive governmental institutions, cultural practices, and social structures that would influence English development for centuries to come. Understanding these institutional innovations and their long-term significance requires careful examination of how Cerdic transformed the temporary bonds of warrior loyalty into permanent foundations of royal authority and territorial governance. The administrative structure that Cerdic established for governing his expanding kingdom reflected a sophisticated understanding of the practical challenges involved in ruling diverse populations across extensive territories. Rather than attempting to govern all conquered areas through direct royal control, he developed a hierarchical system that delegated significant authority to trusted subordinates while maintaining ultimate royal oversight of military, judicial, and fiscal matters. This approach balanced the need for effective local administration with the requirements of unified royal authority that could respond quickly to external threats or internal challenges. The warrior aristocracy that had evolved from Cerdic's original followers formed the backbone of this administrative system. These men, transformed from dependent warriors into landed aristocrats through grants of conquered territory, became the local administrators responsible for maintaining royal authority throughout the kingdom. Their transformation from purely military followers into territorial governors created powerful incentives for continued loyalty while providing the human resources necessary for effective governance of complex political and social relationships. The integration of British populations into this Saxon-dominated political system required institutional innovations that could accommodate different legal traditions, cultural practices, and social expectations within a unified governmental framework. Cerdic's apparent success in achieving this integration suggests the development of flexible legal and administrative systems that could function effectively across ethnic and cultural boundaries while maintaining overall political coherence. The legal institutions that emerged during Cerdic's reign probably combined Germanic customary law with Roman legal traditions that had survived the collapse of imperial administration. This synthesis created distinctive legal systems that could address the complex property relationships, contractual obligations, and criminal matters that characterized early medieval society while maintaining consistency with broader Anglo-Saxon legal developments. The royal courts that Cerdic established served multiple functions beyond simple legal administration. They provided forums for resolving disputes between different ethnic communities, establishing property rights, enforcing contractual obligations, and maintaining public order throughout the kingdom. The effectiveness of these judicial institutions was crucial for maintaining social stability and economic productivity in territories that had experienced decades of warfare and political disruption. The military organisation that Cerdic developed represented one of his most significant institutional innovations. The system combined professional warriors maintained at the royal court with the local militia forces that could be mobilised for specific campaigns or defensive operations. This dual structure provided the kingdom with both rapid response capabilities for dealing with immediate threats and the ability to field large armies for major military undertakings without placing excessive burdens on agricultural productivity. The professional warrior class that formed the core of this military system was supported through a combination of royal grants, tribute, payments, and proceeds from successful campaigns. These warriors served not only as soldiers, but also as administrators, diplomats, and symbols of royal authority throughout the kingdom. Their presence in local communities provided both security and visible reminders of royal power that helped maintain political stability during periods of potential unrest. The economic foundations of the West Saxon kingdom reflected similar institutional sophistication in their combination of traditional agricultural production with innovative approaches to trade, tribute collection, and resource management. The kingdom's control of important transportation routes generated revenue through tolls and trading fees while facilitating the movement of goods and information that supported economic development and political communication. The agricultural estates that formed the backbone of the kingdom's economy were probably organised according to systems that combined Saxon land management practices with existing British agricultural techniques. This synthesis allowed for the maintenance of productive capacity while gradually introducing innovations that could increase yields and support larger non-agricultural populations, including warriors, craftsmen, and administrators. The tribute systems that Cerdic established for extracting resources from conquered territories represented another important institutional innovation. Rather than simply plundering defeated enemies, he developed systematic approaches to taxation and tribute collection that could provide reliable revenue streams while avoiding the economic disruption that would have reduced long-term productive capacity. The trading relationships that the kingdom developed with neighbouring territories and continental markets provided additional sources of revenue while supplying exotic goods that could be used to reward followers and demonstrate royal wealth and power. The kingdom's strategic position controlling important coastal areas and river valleys gave it significant advantages in regulating and profiting from commercial activities. The cultural institutions that emerged during Cerdic's reign were equally significant for the kingdom's long-term development and identity. The royal court served as a centre for cultural exchange and artistic development, where Saxon and British traditions could interact and influence each other in creative ways. The warrior aristocracy that surrounded the king provided both audiences and patrons for cultural activities, while serving as vehicles for spreading cultural innovations throughout the kingdom. The architectural developments that occurred during this period reflected the growing wealth and sophistication of Saxon society under royal leadership. Royal and aristocratic residences became larger and more elaborate, incorporating both Germanic and Roman design elements in ways that created distinctive architectural styles. These buildings served not only as practical living spaces but also as symbols of royal authority and cultural achievement that could impress both subjects and foreign visitors. The artistic innovations that emerged from the cultural synthesis occurring in early Wessex created distinctive forms of material culture that combined traditional Saxon motifs with influences drawn from British and continental sources. Craftsmen working in metal, wood, stone, and textile created objects that served both practical and ceremonial purposes while demonstrating the cultural vitality and economic prosperity of the kingdom. The religious institutions that developed during Cerdic's reign were probably characterised by the same pragmatic tolerance that marked his approach to other cultural differences. As a pagan ruler governing both Saxon and British Christian populations, he would have needed to develop religious policies that could maintain social stability while avoiding unnecessary conflicts over doctrinal or ceremonial matters. The approach that Cerdic adopted toward religious questions probably involved allowing different communities to maintain their traditional practices, while gradually encouraging cultural exchange and mutual influence that could reduce tensions and promote social integration. This tolerant approach created conditions for the eventual peaceful Christianization of Saxon populations, while maintaining the political loyalty of Christian British subjects. The educational and intellectual institutions that began to develop during this period were probably informal and centred around the royal court. but they played important roles in preserving and transmitting the cultural knowledge necessary for effective governance and social cohesion. The presence of British subjects with Latin literacy and classical education, combined with Saxon oral traditions and practical knowledge, created opportunities for intellectual synthesis that enriched the cultural life of the kingdom. The diplomatic institutions that Cerdic established for managing relationships with neighbouring rulers represented another area of significant institutional innovation. The complex web of alliances, treaties, and mutual obligations that connected early medieval kingdoms required sophisticated diplomatic capabilities that could negotiate agreements, monitor compliance, and adapt to changing political circumstances. The marriage alliances that probably formed an important component of these diplomatic relationships served multiple purposes in strengthening the kingdom's external position while creating internal bonds that could enhance political stability. Strategic marriages could cement military alliances, provide access to new territories or resources, and create kinship networks that facilitated communication and cooperation across political boundaries. The ceremonial and symbolic aspects of royal authority that Cerdic developed were equally important for maintaining the legitimacy and effectiveness of his political innovations. The pageantry and ritual associated with royal courts served to reinforce social hierarchies, demonstrate royal power, and create shared cultural experiences that could promote political unity among diverse populations. The succession arrangements that Cerdic established during his final years represented perhaps his most crucial institutional contribution to the kingdom's long-term stability. The gradual integration of his son Cynric into royal responsibilities created precedents for peaceful dynastic transition that would help the kingdom avoid the succession crises that destroyed many early medieval political entities. The institutional legacy that Cerdic left to his successors provided the foundation for centuries of West Saxon political development and eventual English unification. The governmental structures, legal systems, military organisations and cultural institutions that he created would be modified and adapted by later rulers, but their basic frameworks would continue to influence English political and social development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The kingdom that Cerdic built was thus far more than a simple territorial conquest or military achievement. It was a complex institutional creation that successfully combined diverse cultural traditions, innovative governmental practices, and pragmatic approaches to the practical challenges of early medieval politics. The institutions that he created would prove their effectiveness through their ability to survive and adapt to changing circumstances, while maintaining the essential characteristics that made Wessex one of the most successful and enduring kingdoms in early medieval Europe. The death of Cerdic in 534 CE marked not the end of his historical significance, but rather the beginning of a dynastic legacy that would ultimately reshape the entire political landscape of medieval Britain. The royal bloodline that he established would produce some of the most important rulers in English history, from the immediate successors who consolidated his territorial gains, to the great kings who would eventually unify all of England under West Saxon leadership. Understanding this dynastic continuity requires examining both the immediate succession arrangements that Cerdic established and the longer-term political developments that elevated his descendants to positions of unprecedented power and influence. The succession of Cynric to royal authority following his father's death demonstrated the effectiveness of the dynastic arrangements that Cerdic had carefully constructed during his final years. Unlike many early medieval kingdoms that experienced violent succession crises or political fragmentation, after the death of founding rulers, Wessex achieved a smooth transition of power that maintained political stability while preserving the institutional innovations that Cerdic had created during his reign. Cynric's position as designated successor had been established through his participation in major military campaigns and administrative decisions during the later years of his father's reign. This gradual integration into royal responsibilities ensured that he possessed both the practical experience and the political relationships necessary for effective leadership, while demonstrating to potential rivals and subjects alike that the dynastic succession enjoyed royal approval and institutional support. The 26-year reign that Cynric enjoyed after his father's death provided crucial consolidation time that allowed the kingdom to absorb and stabilise the territorial gains achieved during Cerdic's conquest campaigns. Rather than attempting dramatic new territorial expansions that might have overextended royal resources or provoked coordinated resistance from neighbouring rulers, Cynric focused on strengthening the internal foundations of the kingdom while conducting selective military operations that demonstrated continued Saxon military capabilities. The military campaigns that Cynric undertook during his reign, including notable victories at Cerebur, Old Sarum, in 552, and at Berenbeirig, Barbary Castle, in 556, showed both continuity with his father's strategic vision and adaptation to changing political circumstances. These operations extended Saxon control further into Wiltshire, while demonstrating that the West Saxon military system could continue to achieve significant victories under the second generation of royal leadership. The administrative and institutional developments that occurred during Cynric's reign built upon the foundations that his father had established, while adapting to the changing needs of a maturing kingdom. The warrior aristocracy that had emerged during Cerdic's conquest campaigns continued to serve as the backbone of royal administration, but their roles evolved to emphasize territorial governance and economic management rather than purely military functions. The third generation of West Saxon royal leadership, represented by Ceawlin, who succeeded Cynric around 560 CE, demonstrated the continuing vitality and ambition of Cerdic's dynastic line. Ceawlin's reign marked a new phase of territorial expansion that extended Saxon control far beyond the boundaries established by his predecessors, reaching into the Thames Valley, the Cotswolds, and even parts of what would later become Wales. The military achievements of Ceawlin's reign, including the crucial victory at Dyrham in 577 CE that resulted in the capture of Bath, Cirencester and Gloucester, represented the culmination of strategic objectives that could be traced back to Cerdic's original vision of Saxon domination throughout southern Britain. These victories eliminated the last major British strongholds in the region, while establishing Saxon control over territories that would remain central to English political development for centuries to come. The political significance of Ceawlin's achievements extended beyond their immediate territorial impact to establish Wessex as one of the major powers in early medieval Britain. His recognition as a Bretwalda, a high king exercising overlordship over other Anglo-Saxon rulers, demonstrated that the kingdom founded by Cerdic had achieved a position of hegemonic authority that could influence political developments throughout England. The institutional innovations that characterised Ceawlin's reign similarly built upon the governmental foundations established by his predecessors while adapting to the challenges of ruling much larger and more diverse territories. The administrative systems that had proven effective for governing Cerdic's original conquests were expanded and modified to accommodate the needs of a kingdom that now encompassed multiple former British territories with their own cultural traditions and political expectations. The subsequent generations of West Saxon rulers continued to build upon the dynastic legacy established by Cerdic, while facing new challenges that tested the resilience and adaptability of the political institutions he had created. The period following Ceawlin's death saw temporary setbacks and political instability that demonstrated both the vulnerabilities inherent in early medieval kingship and the underlying strength of the institutional foundations that had been established during the kingdom's formative years. The revival of West Saxon power during the 7th century under rulers like Cadwalla and Ian showed the continuing vitality of Cerdic's dynastic line and the enduring effectiveness of the political and military systems that he had established. These rulers achieved new territorial conquests while developing more sophisticated approaches to law, administration, and cultural development that reflected the growing maturity and confidence of West Saxon political institutions. The legal innovations that characterised Inie's reign, including the promulgation of one of the earliest surviving Anglo-Saxon law codes, demonstrated the continued evolution of the governmental systems that traced their origins back to Cerdic's pragmatic approaches to ruling diverse populations. These legal developments established precedents and principles that would influence English legal development for centuries, while providing practical solutions to the administrative challenges of governing complex territorial kingdoms. The cultural achievements of these later West Saxon rulers similarly built upon the foundations of cultural synthesis and institutional innovation that had characterised Cerdic's approach to conquest and governance. The royal courts that developed during this period became centres of artistic and intellectual activity that attracted talented individuals from throughout Britain and continental Europe, while fostering distinctive forms of cultural expression that combined Saxon, British, and broader European influences. The 8th century represented a period of temporary eclipse for West Saxon power as the Kingdom of Mercia achieved hegemonic dominance throughout much of central England. However, the institutional resilience and dynastic continuity that characterised Wessex during this period demonstrated the lasting effectiveness of the political foundations that Cerdic had established more than 2 centuries earlier. The kingdom survived this period of subordination while maintaining its distinctive identity and governmental institutions. The dramatic revival of West Saxon power during the 9th century under Egbert and his successors represented not just a return to previous levels of political influence, but the beginning of a new phase of expansion that would ultimately lead to the unification of England under West Saxon leadership. The military and political capabilities that enabled this remarkable resurgence were built upon institutional foundations that could be traced directly back to the innovations pioneered by Cerdic during the kingdom's founding period. The reign of Alfred the Great represented the culmination of developments that had begun with Cerdic's original conquest campaigns. Alfred's success in defending England against Viking invasions, his innovations in military organisation and governmental administration, and his cultural and educational achievements all built upon institutional foundations and dynastic traditions that traced their origins back to the kingdom's founding father. The political philosophy that guided Alfred's approach to kingship, with its emphasis on the responsibilities of royal authority for protecting and serving subjects, reflected principles that could be traced back through the dynastic tradition to Cerdic's pragmatic approaches to conquest and governance. The institutional innovations that Alfred pioneered, including his reforms of military organisation, legal systems and educational institutions, similarly built upon foundations established by his distant predecessor. The ultimate achievement of English unification under Alfred's successors, Edward the Elder, Aethelstan and their heirs, represented the fulfilment of territorial and political ambitions that could be traced back to Cerdic's original vision of Saxon dominance throughout southern Britain. The kingdom that had begun as a small warband landing on the Hampshire coast had evolved into the dominant power in medieval Britain through the consistent application of political and military principles established during its founding period. The European significance of this English unification extended far beyond its immediate political impact to influence the broader development of medieval European civilization. The institutional innovations, cultural achievements, and political precedents established by the West Saxon dynasty provided models and inspiration for political developments throughout medieval Europe, while contributing to the emergence of England as a major European power. The genealogical claims that connected later English royal houses to Cerdic's bloodline reflected both the historical importance of his achievements and the continuing political significance of his dynastic legacy. Whether or not these genealogical connections were historically accurate in all their details, they accurately reflected the foundational importance of Cerdic's political innovations for the development of English royal authority and governmental institutions. The legal and constitutional principles that emerged from the West Saxon political tradition similarly influenced English political development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The balance between royal authority and aristocratic privileges, the integration of diverse populations within unified governmental systems, and the adaptation of traditional institutions to changing circumstances all reflected approaches to political organisation that could be traced back to Cerdic's original governmental innovations. The cultural legacy of Cerdic's dynastic line was equally significant for the long-term development of English civilization. The synthesis of Saxon, British, and broader European cultural elements that had begun during the kingdom's founding period continued to evolve under subsequent rulers, while maintaining distinctive characteristics that became defining features of English cultural identity. The historical significance of Cerdic's dynastic legacy thus extends far beyond the immediate achievements of his own reign, or even those of his immediate successors. The political institutions, cultural innovations, and governmental principles that he established provided the foundation for centuries of English political development, while contributing to broader patterns of European medieval civilization that influenced world history for millennia to come. The transformation of Britain during the 6th century CE represented one of the most significant periods of political, cultural, and social change in the island's long history. At the centre of this transformation stood Cerdic, whose 4-decade career as war leader and king fundamentally altered the trajectory of British development in ways that would influence the course of European and world history for centuries to come. Understanding the full scope of his historical impact requires examining not only his immediate achievements, but also the longer-term consequences of his political innovations, territorial conquests, and cultural synthesis. The political landscape that Cerdic encountered upon his arrival in Britain in 495 CE was characterized by fragmentation, instability, and the gradual breakdown of the Roman administrative systems that had provided unity and order for nearly 4 centuries. The withdrawal of imperial authority had created a power vacuum that various British rulers, Saxon war leaders, and other ambitious individuals sought to fill through military conquest, political manoeuvring, and territorial expansion. Into this chaotic environment stepped Cerdic, whose unique combination of military skill, political acumen, and cultural flexibility would enable him to create lasting political institutions where others had achieved only temporary success. The immediate impact of Cerdic's campaigns was the establishment of Saxon political control over some of the most strategically important territories in southern Britain. The regions that he conquered, Hampshire, Wiltshire, parts of Berkshire, and the Isle of Wight, controlled crucial transportation routes, productive agricultural lands, and strategic coastal positions that would provide the foundation for centuries of West Saxon political and economic dominance. More importantly, these territories served as a secure base from which subsequent Saxon expansion could be launched throughout the rest of Britain. The military innovations that Cerdic pioneered during his campaigns had equally significant long-term consequences for the development of medieval warfare. His integration of traditional Germanic tactical methods with Roman military techniques created new forms of military organisation that proved highly effective against both British and Saxon opponents. The warrior aristocracy that emerged from his campaigns provided models for military and political leadership that would be copied throughout Anglo-Saxon England, while establishing precedents for the feudal military systems that would dominate medieval European warfare. The governmental institutions that Cerdic established represented perhaps his most significant contribution to the long-term development of English political culture. His pragmatic approach to ruling diverse populations created administrative systems that could accommodate different ethnic groups, legal traditions, and cultural practices within unified political frameworks. These institutional innovations provided templates for the successful integration of conquered populations that would be essential for the eventual unification of England under royal authority. The legal systems that emerged from Cerdic's reign combined Germanic customary law with Roman legal traditions in ways that created distinctive approaches to justice, property rights, and contractual relationships. These legal innovations established precedents that would influence English legal development throughout the medieval period, while contributing to the emergence of common law systems that would eventually spread throughout much of the world through English colonial expansion. The economic changes that accompanied Cerdic's conquest campaigns had profound consequences for the development of medieval English society. The territorial expansion that he achieved provided access to new resources, markets, and trading opportunities that generated the wealth necessary to support increasingly sophisticated political and cultural institutions. The agricultural innovations that occurred under Saxon rule increased productive capacity while creating surplus resources that could support larger non-agricultural populations, including craftsmen, warriors, administrators, and clerics. The cultural synthesis that characterized Cerdic's approach to conquest and governance created new forms of artistic expression, architectural design, and intellectual activity that combined Saxon, British, and broader European influences in innovative ways. This cultural mixing established patterns of creative adaptation and international influence that would become defining characteristics of English civilization, while contributing to the emergence of distinctive cultural traditions that would influence European development for centuries. The religious implications of Cerdic's reign were similarly significant for the long-term development of English Christianity. His pragmatic tolerance toward religious differences created conditions for peaceful cultural exchange between pagan Saxon and Christian British populations that facilitated the eventual Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England. The religious institutions that emerged from this synthesis would play crucial roles in preserving classical learning, developing educational systems, and maintaining international connections that enriched English cultural life. The demographic changes that accompanied Saxon settlement under Cerdic's leadership had lasting consequences for the ethnic and cultural composition of medieval England. The integration of Saxon and British populations created mixed communities that combined elements from both traditions while developing new forms of social organisation and cultural identity. These demographic patterns established foundations for the distinctive characteristics of English society that would persist throughout the medieval period and beyond. The linguistic changes that occurred during and after Cerdic's reign were equally significant for the development of the English language. The gradual dominance of Saxon languages throughout his territories, combined with the incorporation of significant numbers of British and Latin loanwords, created the linguistic foundations from which modern English would eventually emerge. The place names, personal names, and institutional terminology that developed during this period reflected the complex process of cultural integration that characterized Cerdic's approach to governance. The international implications of Cerdic's achievements extended throughout the complex network of relationships that connected early medieval Britain to continental Europe. The success of his kingdom encouraged additional Saxon migration to Britain, while demonstrating the potential rewards of overseas territorial expansion. The diplomatic relationships that he established with neighbouring rulers created precedents for international cooperation and conflict that would influence European political development for generations. The technological innovations that emerged from the cultural synthesis occurring in Cerdic's kingdom had significant consequences for medieval economic and military development. The combination of Saxon metalworking techniques with British and Roman technological knowledge created improvements in weapon manufacturing, agricultural tools, and architectural construction that increased economic productivity while enhancing military capabilities. The urban development that began during Cerdic's reign established patterns of town growth and commercial activity that would characterize medieval English economic development. The fortified settlements that he established for military purposes gradually evolved into commercial centres that facilitated trade, manufacturing, and cultural exchange while serving as focal points for regional administration and political authority. The educational institutions that began to emerge during this period, while initially limited in scope, established precedents for the preservation and transmission of knowledge that would prove crucial for the intellectual development of medieval England. The royal courts that served as centres for cultural exchange provided forums where different intellectual traditions could interact and influence each other in creative ways. The constitutional principles that emerged from Cerdic's political innovations had long-term consequences for the development of English governmental institutions. The balance between royal authority and aristocratic privileges that characterized his approach to governance established precedents for the limitation of monarchical power that would influence English constitutional development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The strategic vision that guided Cerdic's territorial expansion established geographical foundations for English political unity that would prove crucial for the eventual unification of the country under his distant successors. The territories that he conquered controlled natural boundaries, transportation routes, and economic resources that provided advantages for subsequent military and political expansion throughout Britain. The social innovations that accompanied Cerdic's conquest campaigns created new forms of aristocratic organisation and popular participation in governance that influenced the development of medieval English society. The warrior aristocracy that emerged from his reign provided models for noble privilege and responsibility that balanced personal advancement with service to royal authority and public welfare. The historical significance of Cerdic's achievements thus extends far beyond the immediate political and military success that he achieved during